In 2010, a new West London high-rise complex, decked out in bright tangerine and lime green cladding, opened its doors near Tottenham Court Tube Station. Designed by Italian architect Renzo Piano, the site was a statement piece and a shrine to 21st century hipsterdom. The airy piazza offered passers-by carefully selected gastro fare from a range of upscale eateries, Brazilian barbecue, Southeast Asian coffee, and seasonal healthy food served in compostable packaging for the eco-aware. Several stories up and overlooking the same square was one of the offices of search engine giant Google, replete with its quirky creative spaces and well-paid urban professionals. It was a space that was free of any signs of want or distress, and an end point in a long journey towards respectability that started at the lowest point of London's history. Back down on the ground, and 250 years earlier, this plot of land could not have been more different. It was the site of the Rookery, the most notorious slum London had ever known. A rabbit warren of tangled streets associated with Irish immigrants in particular, the area developed a fierce reputation for poverty, vice, and crime. William Hogarth, a Londoner and the nation's greatest visual satirist, made St Giles Rookery into a metaphor for the metropolis at its worst. His most famous print, Gin Lane, from 1751, used the buildings of the slum as the background for debauchery brought on by the gin craze of the early 18th century. Over the shoulder of the drunken woman dropping her baby is the unmistakable spire of St George's Bloomsbury Church, leaving no doubt as to the location of the scene for any Londoner of the day. He used the area again the same year as the setting for his The First Stage of Cruelty caricature, depicting local children in St Giles torturing a veritable menagerie of animals in what Hogarth implied was schooling for a future life of crime. The reputation stuck. 40 years later, another satirist, Thomas Rowlandson, used St Giles as the obvious contrast to the gentility a few miles away in St James's Parish. Rowlandson was so confident that his audience would get the joke connecting St Giles with poverty and ignorance that he merely mentioned the parish's name and left the viewer to fill in the details. Scottish satirist Isaac Cruikshank in 1799 opted for something less subtle, depicting an unapologetic local woman relieving herself in the high street. This print, Indecency, was a comment on the type of person Cruikshank felt characterized the area by the century's end. The parade of derogatory depictions continued. 70 years and 3 monarchs after Hogarth engraved Gin Lane, the site again found its way into print. This time as the location for the fictional Englishmen out on the town, Tom and Jerry, looking for a place to slum it with the local cadgers for an evening in 1821. Few British slums have amassed such mythical and long-lasting reputations as did the Rookery of St Giles-in-the-Fields, in part because few have been allowed to persist for as long as that particular slum stood on a plot of West London land. Its reputation firmly established when Hogarth committed it to print in 1751, the Rookery remained a fixture of the capital for another century, finally coming to an unceremonious end in 1847 when authorities drove Oxford Street through the middle of it, marking the beginning of a gentrification project that would redefine the area. This paper asks why. Why there? Why then? And why for so long? Why was that the site of the country's most notorious slum? What factors enabled and even encouraged its development? And why did it take more than a century for London to decide it had had enough? Cutting through the mythology of this infamous space, this paper follows both the money and the people who sculpted the site over the decades, from its origins as a field to the northwest of London, to its gradual decline into a slum, and to the very beginnings of its eventual revitalization in the Victorian era. By considering the geography, economics, and legal influences acting upon the space and the people who interacted with it, it becomes clear that the Rookery of St Giles-in-the-Fields was always high risk because of happenstances of geography, but that a few key decisions and unfortunate mishaps led to its longevity and the depths of its depravity. The hyperbolic and satirical depictions of the Rookery have sculpted our memory of the space in ways that make it difficult to understand it as a real environment experienced by real people. These embellished memories are especially problematic when trying to understand the factors that led to the area's decline. For instance, there are many cartoons, but few detailed maps of the space. Those maps we do have tend not to include the same level of precision for the slum as they do for the surrounding streets. This is in sharp juxtaposition to the level of detail in most contemporary charts, with many going so far as to purport to show the footprint of each of the city's thousands of buildings. Not so for the Rookery, which, for example, on Richard Horwood's map of the metropolis from the 1790s, simply left a shaded-in spot where the slum sat, as if to say, we didn't go in there. Other commercial maps, too, may show an alleyway leading off from the main road, but look as if they were crafted from the safety of the high street, rather than measured from within. Respectable artists, too, tended to stay away. There are relatively few drawings from the 18th century that purport to be lifelike representations inside the Rookery. Often caricatured, rarely painted, the Rookery remained a mysterious space. Some of the first and perhaps most honest visual representations of the site were painted by John Wickham Archer in 1840, just a few years before it was torn down. In sharp contrast to the active debauchery of Hogarth or Cruikshank, Archer showed a space that was quiet, lonely, and perhaps unloved. His paintings give a sense of people trying to get by in a forgotten neighborhood. To understand why the Rookery developed when and where it did, it's important to recognize it as a real space. One of the best ways to do that is to do a reality check on the extent of the slum. It was not a sprawling tangle of streets that went on forever. It was a well-contained site a little larger than a pair of football pitches, bounded clearly on all sides by more substantial roads that marked its edges. Relative to the size of the entire metropolis, it was almost inconsequentially small, a single neighborhood in one of more than 100 London parishes. The containment of the Rookery is important because though the whole parish of St Giles-in-the-Fields became synonymous with depravity, most of it was quite nice by contemporary standards. The Rookery was an exception and was in stark contrast to the beautiful neighborhoods, some of which were immediately across the street. In fact, on all four sides, the Rookery looked into wealthy communities. To the immediate west was the charming and famously French area known as Soho Square, just across the parish boundary. To the south and the parish's southwest was St Giles, whose owner converted a marshland into beautiful new district between 1693 and 1708. The 7 intersecting streets, dials, met at the middle at a Doric pillar and were designed to leave a recognizable mark on the map of London. The area was built specifically with the intention of charging higher than average rents facing wide streets that would attract shopkeepers. To the east was the parish of St George Bloomsbury, home to the palatial mansions Montague House and Bedford House, the former purchased as the British Museum in 1759. And to the immediate north from the 1770s and 80s was the Bedford Estate, a well-planned multi-street development aimed at a genteel audience that has maintained a reputation for opulence into the 21st century. Rather than a deprived part of town, the Rookery was uniquely run down in an otherwise lovely area. The question is why, and the answer is not a simple one. Multiple factors played their own part in the sculpting of this site over many decades. None were enough to seal the slum's fate on their own, but each helped to create the conditions for depravity before a perfect storm came together in the 18th and early 19th centuries. The first factor was geography. The location of this plot of land was unique, both within London and Britain. The Rookery site stood for decades on the city's outermost frontier, the edge of town. For most of its history, London had remained relatively compact. It was a city still protected by medieval walls during the reign of Elizabeth I, occupying a site on the north shore of the River Thames. To the west, in an area now known as the West End, was still fields. Names of parishes in the area testify to this fact, including St Martin-in-the-Fields, now the site of Trafalgar Square, and St Giles-in-the-Fields, the home of the future Rookery. Prior to its development, the parish of St Giles had been the site of a medieval leper hospital, which, at a mile from town, was considered a safe distance. The hospital now gone by the Elizabethan era, the site of the Rookery remained a field until at least the 1580s, according to contemporary maps. But this was beginning to change. Slowly but surely, London pushed outwards into these fields. Substantial landowners who controlled multi-acre plots began laying roads and erecting houses further and further from the city's protective walls. The parish of St Giles, too, started to spring to life. Its handful of landowners carved out their parcels of land to house the growing number of new Londoners arriving to take up urban lives. In the northwest corner of St Giles-in-the-Fields was a 5-acre site that would become the Rookery. Its first modern buildings went up in the late 16th century, a row of smart dwellings lining St Giles High Street. In behind lay pasture that stayed untouched for nearly a century. Beyond that, fields. Miles and miles of fields. Soon after these houses were erected, the city abruptly stopped expanding. The cause was the Civil War waged between King and Parliament in the middle of the 17th century. As the threat of royalist forces grew, the city's parliamentary leaders decided to dig in and fortify. It was a decision that would freeze London for a generation. Drawing upon medieval principles of defense, the authorities hired the very builders who had erected the thousands of new houses to construct an earthenwork wall around all of London, supported by a network of forts that could defend the city. The wall and one of those forts was positioned directly across the street from the Rookery. The fact that this happened when the Rookery was on the edge of town was merely a matter of chance. When the need to fortify London presented itself, that just happened to be as far as the city had thus far expanded. But because the urban sprawl stayed still for so long, the site became known as the symbolic northwestern edge of the metropolis, even decades after substantial building work resumed further afield in the 1690s. To mark that symbolism in 1715, the local authorities submitted a proposal to the government seeking funding for a new church to be built directly across the street from that infamous slum in the making. The parishioners argued that it would be a great monument to London, the first spire they would see on their way into town. 19th century historian of the parish, Roland Dobie, argued that a good church there would be as great an ornament and as much exposed to view as any church which could be built in town. The locals were not exaggerating when they talked about their parish church as the first spire travelers would see. For a huge number of people, it was. That was because the National Road Network put the Rookery at the end of 3 of the most important routes into London. Both of those coming from the west, via Oxford and via Bristol, and one from the north, via Hampstead. Together, these 3 roads were the logical migration routes into London for positively colossal numbers of people coming from across Britain and Ireland. Because of this, Roland Dobie described the area as the Great Thoroughfare, uniquely well connected both in London and in Britain more broadly. Travel by road was the preferred mode of internal migration for many within Britain. A sea journey was of course possible for migrants, and many did arrive by water and thus skip St Giles entirely, instead populating similarly poor regions in the city's east end. But the ocean remained dangerous and expensive throughout the 18th century, particularly for those having to cross the Irish Sea. Even wealthy travelers such as Lord's Lieutenant often opted to minimize the length of the sea crossing to Ireland if at all possible. That meant that most people coming across from Dublin or Belfast made land at Holyhead in Wales, the shortest crossing point, and from there the most direct route to London went via Oxford. This entered London as Oxford Street, which prior to its extension in 1847 ended exactly at the Rookery, where traffic turned sharply to the south before continuing east as St Giles High Street. One simply could not miss the Rookery when coming along this very straight road from the west. Travellers from Ireland's southern province, including the city of Cork, took a southern route via Milford Haven in Wales or Bristol in the English southwest. For them, the road into town was the Great Western Road. It entered London in an area just south of Hyde Park, becoming Piccadilly Street. At what is now Piccadilly Circus, it jogged north slightly, taking travellers again directly to the Rookery. These 2 routes, near bereft of turns, were also the clearest paths to London for all people coming overland from Wales, the West Midlands, and the southwest of England. The third route into London came via the Great Northern Road. This road split a few miles north of the city, with one of the options to take the Hampstead Road, becoming Tottenham Court Road as it entered town. Tottenham Court Road ran alongside the Rookery's western edge, meaning that the whole of the north, including all of the industrial mill towns of Yorkshire and on to Scotland, was but a single road to St Giles. For those passengers from the north of Ireland who decided to cross into Scotland before making the trip southwards, this Great Northern Road would have been the natural conduit to London. Thus, these were the three most substantial migration routes into London from the west and north, following a path of least resistance from further afield, and all three of them ended directly at the Rookery. No one plot of land was as connected to as many key migration routes as the Rookery of St Giles, and the site was therefore subject to a unique degree of geographical determinism as a space that would become associated with the forces of migration. Its location alone was not grounds for explaining why it became a slum, but its geography within the metropolis did present it with certain economic opportunities that were not necessarily as readily available elsewhere. The most important of those was the short-term accommodation business, which was an opportunity that would come with a cost. The seemingly never-ending supply of short-term tenants may have been a good chance to make quick rents, but also would put the area at risk of failing to develop or sustain a long-term community who would claim civic ownership over the space. Done poorly, it could become the 18th century equivalent of unchecked Airbnb, hollowing out what might otherwise have been vibrant communities with an endless march of temporary visitors on a strict budget. Unfortunately, the temptation of short-term accommodation was too strong for the owners to resist, with tragic consequences for the area. Key to our understanding of the site's development was the fact that it was, at least originally, the estate of a single family. George Harrison erected those first houses on the property in the late 16th century, putting his mark on otherwise empty fields. St Giles, like many parts of London, was typically developed at the level of the multi-street estate, rather than by individuals looking to build a home for themselves. The power these men had over what was built should not be underestimated. Each was able to create a neighborhood befitting of his own tastes and budgets, a process outlined in great detail in the Survey of London series. The effect of the creativity of these men could be seen on the map even centuries after the minor roads were laid out and the buildings constructed. Many of the original plots can still easily be discerned or at least guessed at on the map of today, sitting between the wider boulevards and roads of the metropolis's transportation network. This system of building meant that the new western suburbs of London developed into a patchwork of neighborhoods, rather than necessarily a coherent feel or approach to town planning. It meant the owners of the marshland in the southwest of the parish could build the visually creative Seven Dials commercial hub, while the Duke of Bedford could stamp a residential trophy on his own plot, the elegant Bedford Square, befitting of bearing his name. This type of trophy building was much easier to achieve in London's newest neighborhoods, being stamped on vacant land, than in its more ancient and already built areas closer to the River Thames. Few people would describe the Rookery as a trophy, however, and despite what became of the space, its owner too had a plan that he felt best suited the site. Once the Civil War defenses came down and the monarchy was restored in 1660, the site's then owners, the Bainbridge family, had a chance to enact their distinctly hands-off agenda for the area. They began laying a network of streets, naming one after themselves and others after their three sons-in-law. Then, before taking his final breath, William Bainbridge carved up the estate into a series of plots that were leased to individual developers. It was perhaps a chauvinistic, if paternal, approach to passive land management that would ensure his three daughters had a steady stream of income even after his death, without an active need to manage building works on their own. It was a father's gift to his girls. This decision itself had profound consequences for the area, which I'll return to later. More immediately, it meant that the building work instead fell to the tenants, who had acquired their plots with commercial ambitions. Recognizing the heavy footfall and the potential of the site at the end of the aforementioned national migration routes, Many of these tenants built lodging houses, which offered short-term accommodation, food, and drink for paying guests. This form of enterprise dominated the newly built estate, with few if any shops on the site apart from a couple of public houses. Once the buildings were up, the contractors then sold their lease or further sublet it to individuals who operated a lodging house business at each address. This made the Rookery distinct from others in the area because it had many layers of master rather than one local leader. At the top was the landowner, the three daughters and their families, who passively collected rents from developers, who themselves collected rents from lodging house operators. Once built, nobody had or needed a grand vision. Nobody earned more by keeping the place tidy and up to date. And not only that, but the presence of long leases meant that the estate's future owners could do little but collect their money until the agreements expired. By contrast, in Bedford Square and the surrounding streets, the Duke of Bedford's servants actively managed everything from rent collection to repairs and upgrades that would maintain the prestige of the area. The only people with any real impetus to sculpt the Rookery were the lodging house operators, a group of small business owners operating in rented premises. Run well, a lodging house could be a good earner, with a typical potential annual income in the region of £150, based on rent levels and average size of venue on the site. That figure was before extra charges were added such as food and drink, and represented a good small business opportunity in an otherwise undesirable area. The lodging house industry was a big, if often forgotten, part of the London economy in the 18th and 19th centuries. Its major players were known to offer between 500 and 600 beds per night by the Victorian era, including in the Rookery. The city's most prominent lodging house entrepreneur was said to be worth a staggering £100,000. At the other end of the scale were those who operated a single site, enough to keep them and their families, with a bit left over. The economics behind the lodging house business model meant that what constituted being run well from the perspective of a lodging house keeper was not necessarily what a long-term resident would want for the area. Successful lodging houses chose a strategy that befitted the needs of the local market. In order to take advantage of the type of traveler arriving at the Rookery on foot along the aforementioned roads, the landlords opted for the equivalent of the low-end accommodation market, which was cheap enough for someone at the end of a long journey with little money left in his or her pocket. The approach allowed those with more money to call upon the Duke of Bedford and others further up the road. This meant that many of the lodging houses focused on a high-density short-term model, hosting guests by the day or week. The seasonal nature of travel, especially for those arriving to work in summer in the booming local construction business, meant that profit had to be made quickly during the high season. The stiff competition drove prices down to rock-bottom levels, with some charging as little as 1 pence per night for customers willing to sleep on the bare floorboards. If you're charging that little per head, you've got to make up the difference somehow. Every effort went into maximizing the volume of customers. This included digging down, an unusual practice for London. Landlords used the cellars to expand the rentable space into the bowels of the earth. Without natural light, ventilation, or drainage, they became breeding grounds for typhus, or what was sometimes referred to as Irish fever, a sort of backhanded tribute to the large numbers of Irish inhabitants in the space. Building also went backward. Traditionally, rear garden space in behind London houses was a space for hanging, washing, and otherwise disposing of liquid waste. However, within the Rookery, these spaces were instead used for industrial purposes. There were 3 such sites in the Rookery, a timber yard and 2 breweries that operated at different times. That's 1 per daughter, remembering the split made by William Bainbridge. These industrial premises meant that few houses had anything resembling a back garden, and made sanitation particularly difficult for those living therein. As a space that was at the time on the edge of town, the location for heavy industry was perhaps not as strange as it might now seem. However, the dust of the timber yards and the smell of the brew houses may have helped drive away inhabitants who could afford to live in areas that offered fewer assaults on the senses, or the unlikely risk of drowning in hundreds of thousands of gallons of beer, which, though unlikely, was a realized risk that cost 8 inhabitants their lives in 1814. The deaths by beer notwithstanding, better planning regulation may have helped prevent the Rookery's decline into its most intense depths in the late 18th century. But planning remained lacking, and poor decision after poor decision was allowed to go ahead unchecked. Density exploded when one of the brewhouse leases expired in the second half of the 18th century. Up to that point, all accommodation had been in houses with direct access to the main road. Thereafter, the new tenant chose to draw on the success of the accommodation business in the area and saw an opportunity to build dozens of tiny buildings to rent out to lodgers on the old brewery site. The result was a dense tangle of buildings, which you can see on the screen, and which was the state of the property in 1851 when it was finally put up for sale for redevelopment. As the map shows, once the brewery site was closed and converted to housing, most of the buildings in the Rookery could not be seen from the main road, and were accessible only via narrow passages, many of which were less than 2 feet wide. Thus, the Rookery developed through the efforts of a series of opportunistic contractors fighting to squeeze ever more rentable space into the area. Up sprung a patchwork of sheds, and in flowed the poor. It was capitalism gone mad. The effect of this was dangerous overcrowding. According to a Victorian-era estimate by Thomas Beams, parts of the area were even more densely settled than the spaces below deck on transatlantic slaving vessels, and they were 5 times more packed than the minimum standards for space in the prisons of the day. The conditions therein blurred the lines between rough sleeping and sheltered accommodation. The lack of sanitation facilities and the fact that nobody really had any private or secure spaces of their own meant that life within the Rookery had to adapt. With so many strangers, many staying only a few nights, opportunities for securing valuables were few. Inhabitants thus knew it was better to drink away your wages than have them go missing in the middle of the night. It was a reality that kept the poor in a state of poverty and helped keep the slum a slum. The need to keep beds full meant that lodging house keepers learned not to be picky about their clientele. Large numbers of Irish migrants arriving along the road were drawn to the area and even encouraged to it by their fellow Irish men and women. While en route from Ireland to London in 1811, Catherine Hannigan was advised by a stranger that if I was to go to St Giles, I might find some of my country people who would give me a lodging. By this time, the site had earned a range of Irish-inspired nicknames, such as Little Dublin or the Holy Land. This community was well established by the mid-18th century. In 1767, at the behest of the Bishop of London, the officers of the local Church of England priest compiled a census of Catholics in the parish, which became known as the Returns of Papists. The priest counted 622 Catholics, most probably Irish, living in the Rookery. This was likely a low estimate and may not have included people paying by the night. A higher than normal proportion, some 57%, were found to be renting from Catholic householders who were operating the lodging houses in the area. This suggests that even by 1767, Irish Catholics had colonized the Rookery and were actively using it as a Catholic space where Catholics did business with each other. The local landowners, who in other areas were known to discriminate against Catholic occupation, apparently tolerated this in the Rookery. For example, in another part of the parish were 2 adjacent streets with wildly different rates of Catholic occupation. Leuchner's Lane, a few streets to the southeast, was recorded in the same census as having 202 Catholic inhabitants. It was part of another rundown area known as Little Sodom. The street immediately adjacent, and notably owned by a different landlord, was home to very few Catholics. With ownership, the only key difference between the 2 streets, it shows that individual landlords had a heavy influence over the character of their small pockets of London space. The early connections between the Rookery and Ireland endured in part thanks to the people who invited the Irish into their homes and businesses in the area. 50 years after that census of 1767, St Giles remained a key node for coach passengers seeking to travel between London and Ireland, with one of the parish's coaching inns, the George and Blue Boar, making daily trips at 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. to the Emerald Isle. All three of the other coach departure points from London in 1814 left from inns within a mile of the Rookery. For anyone coming to or from Ireland, St Giles was part of that journey. The high concentration of Irish people in the area did not, of course, lead to harmony. Not only was anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment high in England, but not all Irish Catholics saw each other as kin. A journalist writing in 1845 remarked that in times past the Rookery was famous for affrays between the Irish of different provinces, and occasionally lives were lost. This showed that regional identities came to clash when the Irish shared spaces in London streets. This tension likely helped to fuel the negative reputation of the area amongst Protestant Londoners. The reputation of the Rookery was no secret, of course. Londoners knew to avoid it if possible, and amongst the authorities it was well known as a space of vice. One might wonder why it was allowed to endure. Again, the answers are many. However, one of the key reasons was that the site was profitable for so many people. That's not only those who had rights over the land, such as the landlord, the developers, and the lodging house keepers, who were making money obviously through the rents that they were charging, but so too were local people in the area making money. These included, for example, the vicar of St Giles, Henry Gawley, who saw large numbers of Catholic people in the parish as an opportunity. His published work, Some Consternations Upon Clandestine Marriages, which he published in 1750, is a thinly veiled advertisement for his marriage services for the Irish Catholics in the parish who might want to legitimize their vows in a Protestant church. 2 generations later, some unscrupulous local officials too learned that by taking a lax approach towards poor relief record keeping, they could line their own pockets with the leftovers from the poor relief chest. And this is outlined in detail in Roland Doby's 1829 tell-all about parish mismanagement. As Dorothy George pointed out in 1925, this corruption led to a reputation for generosity at the poor relief table, leading to high levels of relief handed out to the local poor, and making St. Giles an attractive destination for those who relied, at least partially, on parish support to survive. Another keen profiteer was Philip Dyett, who found himself owner of the slum in the late 18th century when it was falling towards its darkest days. Dyett's father had married into the Bainbridge family, who had owned it in the later 17th century, and he inherited it through his wife. A generation later, his son Philip was both the owner of the land, but also rose to become the local magistrate. Like many of his tenants who ran lodging houses, Philip did quite well out of the area's poverty, choosing to live amongst their midst in Dyett House on the Rookery's eastern edge. It was from his living room in that house that he spent his days adjudicating complaints and transgressions of the law on behalf of the state. As a result, he found himself in a situation whereby he filled one pocket with rents and the other with fees collected judging his own tenants' actions against the letter of the law. From an economic standpoint, it suited him quite well to have unruly neighbors. He also had a unique level of power over who those neighbors would be. If the site became too crowded or troublesome, Dyett had the power and the will to expel outsiders for a profit, using the Vagrancy Act of 1744 to his financial advantage. Upon his command, any outsider brought before him could be expelled not only from the Rookery, but from London itself, sent back to their parish of legal settlement, or for the Irish back to Ireland. Dyett was very heavily involved in expelling vagrants from London, collecting a fee for each of the 300 plus people that he judged thus in the early 1780s alone. Few magistrates saw as many vagrancy cases as he did, and he was particularly active expelling Irish people, at least 75 of whom were sent back across the Irish Sea at his command. Thus, he earned if they stayed, and he earned if they went. Given his profession, Dyett may have had a vested interest in the area's continued poverty, as it provided him with an endless supply of judicial business, just as the road network supplied the lodging house keepers with endless tenants. Of course, if anyone did complain about him, he was certainly well placed to mount a case in defense of the status quo. As both a member of the Middlesex bench and with personal connections as well as deep legal knowledge, he was in a strong position. Corrupt? Maybe. Profitable? Definitely. The economic approach Diet took towards the site may not have been his first choice. He, like those who came before and after him, were bound in a legal nightmare in which a number of dead men continued to impose their resolve over the site through wills and attempts at generational transfer with many strings attached. Beginning with the 17th century Bainbridge will that split the property in three so three daughters could earn passively, until it was finally torn down and redeveloped, the site was rarely fully in the control of its owners. Each had been bound to treat it as a passive source of income, often for a daughter, for most of its time as a slum. Even those who tried to redevelop it found their hands tied until ultimately they had to go before Parliament in the early 19th century to free the site from the ghosts of owners past. The last man for more than a century to really control a substantial portion of the site was Richard Diet, who inherited the southeastern Diet Third from his father-in-law in 1692. When his wife died unexpectedly a few years later, Richard found himself free to do with the property as he pleased, neither bound to his dead father-in-law nor to his deceased wife. His choice was to seek a new companion, which he found in the form of Arabella Meadows, the daughter of a diplomat. However, Arabella came with a price. His new father-in-law demanded the estate to be put into a trust for his daughter as protection in exchange for her £3,000 dowry. Richard agreed, and the couple married. For 40 years, between 1701 and Arabella's death in 1741, a board of trustees passively ran the Diet estate, paying only just enough attention to ensure Arabella received its dividends. Arabella left the estate to her son Philip, the magistrate aforementioned, who held the property until his own death in 1792. Unlike his father, Philip had no such freedom to do with the site as he pleased. His tenure as owner was immediately hindered by his half-sister Jane of his father's first marriage, who saw the property as hers by right. After all, it had come into the family through her grandfather and mother. Upon hearing of his coming into the estate, Jane sued Philip for £3,000 and won the case at the Court of Chancery. Philip was forced to take out a £3,500 mortgage against the Rookery estate to pay off his half-sister. Already run down after decades of passive management, Philip now found himself the owner of a seriously indebted property. Landed, but without access to money, Philip retired to his sitting room where he chipped away at the debt by administering justice to the area's inhabitants, unable to make badly needed improvements to the area. Over the course of the next 2 generations, the estate continued to be managed passively. It passed from Philip to his great-nephew, an absentee landlord and MP who saw the Rookery as a source of income until his death in 1808, and in his will he passed it to his daughter, also named Arabella. But as was done a century before, a pair of arm's-length executors were appointed to run the business side of things. They were given instructions to ensure his daughter received pin money from the rents in perpetuity, but would not have a right to active management. Having now sat for more than a century without owners able or willing to engage actively in the area, the Rookery fell into deep disrepair. Unhappy with the state of the area, Arabella and her husband fought for the better part of a decade to take control of the derelict site from the executors, finally succeeding in an 1815 Act of Parliament, which reported the buildings had become, for the most part, poor and mean, and many of them are in a very decayed state, so that great sums of money are or will be required to be laid out upon them to prevent their falling into ruin, and the same are liable to great hazards of lots of damage by fire and otherwise. These series of challenges to the finances and management of this state were certainly contributing factors to the decay of the buildings therein. After having been carved up into a series of small leasehold properties in the late 17th century, it was put into a trust from 1701 to 1741, was in serious debt until 1779, under absentee management until 1808, and run by disinterested trustees until 1815. Not until the middle of the 19th century would the site be revitalized, led by the construction of a police station in the heart of the Rookery, as well as the driving of New Oxford Street right through the area in 1847, requiring the demolition of a significant portion of the houses therein, including the house of the Diet family itself. Now, if I've lost you along the way, let me just summarize. Why was the Rookery of St Giles a slum? For many reasons. Its geography at the end of a number of key national migration routes and at the edge of town meant that there was an endless stream of people arriving into the area on foot. To take advantage of that geography, the key industry on the site became the short-term accommodation business, with competing businesses fighting each other in a race to the bottom in order to attract as many customers as possible. It was a local strategy based on volume rather than a high turnover per client. Its owners, too, came to see the site as a line on the balance sheet rather than a family trophy. A number of times the property became tied up in wills and trusts designed to ensure daughters in particular were taken care of after their father died. This lack of strong leadership also meant few opportunities to actually make positive changes. The people in the area, powerless to change the site, found ways instead to profit from it, be that through making marriages, begging, or administering justice on behalf of the crown. In short, everything went wrong that could, and as a result of this comedy of errors, the site slowly fell into a degraded state where it would remain for more than 100 years. Fast forward to the 21st century, and all physical memory of the site's checkered history are gone. As I write, and as we sit through the coronavirus lockdown, it's probably near deserted. But from an undermapped space too dangerous to enter to the offices of the company who's done more than anyone else to map our world, it's a striking shift in the use of urban space. We might make comments about the potential for gentrification of even the worst affected sites of poverty and vice, but I think this paper makes more important contributions. On a local level, building upon the groundwork of the Survey of London series, which already has done a great deal to trace the building history in the parish, this paper substantially revises our understanding of the Rookery's development as a real space. In particular, it cuts through the hyperbole of the sketches of the likes of William Hogarth, or of throwaway comments by historians such as Dorothy George way back in 1925, who insisted, without citing her evidence, that St Giles had become a slum because it developed a reputation for generosity in its distribution of poor relief. George's claim was undoubtedly built upon ex-parish overseer Roland Doby in his 1829 tell-all of parish mismanagement, in which he laid bare deep-rooted corruption amongst the early 19th century local vestrymen, who were embezzling parliamentary funds meant to alleviate local poverty. This generosity thesis should have fallen down long ago. Instead, it's gone unchallenged for nearly a century, often repeated but never scrutinized. With a few exceptions, there have been only limited attempts to understand what went wrong on the site, and to separate the Rookery from its representation in Gin Lane. The so-called generosity was itself a mere historical moment in the 1820s, enabled by a handful of corrupt men who lived but single lifetimes. The nature of St Giles's poor relief in 1820 was in sharp contrast to a parish with a reputation for miserliness a century before. In 1715, St Giles offered poor relief allowances that were very small in proportion to other parishes, by Doby's own reckoning. That was in part because it was already, by virtue of its location at the end of several key migration routes, attracting large number of poor migrants into the area, meaning support was spread thinly. This led to attempts to save every possible penny, and 3 times in the 1720s and 30s, the parish did not pay its contributions to the county vagrancy removal rates, opting instead to scrimp and save, much to the consternation of the Middlesex bench. This paper also makes an important contribution to migration history studies. By looking at local risk factors in detail, we can shift the blame from the poor Irish inhabitants of the site, who are too often understood to be the cause of the area's depravity. In the historiography of Irish London, the site is used as a shorthand for a poor Irish community, just as Rowlandson used it to represent poverty and ignorance, or Hogarth used it to represent drunkenness and violence. But by looking in particular at the role of the owners and the small business operators in the area, it becomes clear that any blame, if that's the right word, for what happened on the site, simply cannot be shifted to immigrants who are allegedly willing to live under poor conditions. There's a much more complicated network of influences shaping this site, and as a historian of migration, I think it's important that studies like this can help us to evidence that need to reapportion responsibility. Finally, this case study has been an important opportunity to understand a historical slum through its entire life cycle. This was a really unique opportunity because most sites are not as well documented within the archives, and I'm grateful in particular for whoever decided to save the diet papers at the London Metropolitan Archives, which helped me to bring this site back to life with such detail. Without them, this story would not be possible, and that's why, in the absence of such papers for other slums, a case study like this is so important for historians and geographers. As a case study, it raises some questions about to what degree the risk factors I've identified here can be applied more widely across historical neighborhoods, both in Britain and around the world. I don't have answers to that question yet, but I hope you'll agree it's an important conversation to keep going. Particularly in an era of fast policy, this study is a reminder that we sometimes need those longer durée approaches to really see how different risk factors slowly interacted with one another to bring a space to its knees. If we always take a quick fix approach to civic problems like the Rookery, we miss opportunities to learn how we can identify sites at future risk of depravity, or how to create conditions that make them less likely. As I hope I've shown, slums don't just happen. But I hope we now have a better idea of where they come from and why they may stick around for as long as they do.